So the whole idea behind the Song Valuation Calculator was, okay, let's start somewhere where like people don't think music is valuable. Let's just show them that it is, even at a small scale. And I had one independent artist reach out, or a couple of independent artists reach out after we launched this thing to say, well, this seems kind of right because I do make this much. And if I multiply this by over a 10-year period based on streams, then like, yeah, I would make this. So that's kind of cool, right? It's like people start to realize, oh, there's value here. Now, I don't know where streaming going, right? Like there are more songs ever being released. The depreciation is probably going to increase on any new music, right? So there's all these other variables at play, but having a starting point just to show people, hey, owning music is valuable, it means something, it's a great place to start.
Episode 15 of Invest in Music. We are here today with Justin Blau of Royal. He's a close friend of mine and an absolute pioneer in the space. He was one of the first people to put music and crypto on the map with his Ultraviolet release. And in today's episode, we talk about their new tool and their song calculator for valuing music and what it's worth. We get into what it looks like to build a career in the future of on-chain music, the different challenges that come with getting people to collect music, and what this could look like when it comes to investing in artists and building a career in Web3 and music and beyond. As a friendly reminder, you can collect this episode on investmusic.xyz. It's the best way to support our guests and support the podcast. And so without further ado, let's get into it. Episode 15 with Justin Blau of Royal. What is up, everyone? We are here today with Justin Blau, the man, the myth, the legend, a close friend of mine. Justin, how are you feeling today, man?
Doing fantastic. How are you?
I'm doing wonderful. You know, we've been having so many conversations the last couple weeks. So I thought, hey, we got to get this guy on the podcast. You guys just released an awesome new tool at Royal. I think a lot of people are really curious to hear what you've been working on. So before we dive in, why don't you give a quick background, as I'm sure you've done plenty of times at this point. But for those who do not know, who is Justin Blau?
Who is Justin Blau? What a question. I am primarily a musician and DJ. I have been since I was 19 years old. I've always experimented with crypto. I've had a fascination with distributed ledger tech and all the benefits of decentralization, how that might affect the music business. And so over the past 7 years really, 9 is an exaggeration. For the past 7 years, I've been experimenting in both fields and figuring out ways to leverage the technology to benefit the music business and artists.
It's amazing. And I think many people would know you as one of the pioneers in the on-chain music space. You know, obviously you've had record-breaking sales. You've done so much for the space, and now you're the founder of a company called Royal. And I'd love for you to maybe give a quick background on Royal and how that ties into your artist project and anything else you want to say about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess it makes sense to maybe give a little bit of a history for context. Should we start with a little history?
Let's do it.
In how I sort of arrived at Royal, and then I'm sure we'll talk about a lot of other things too. So I got into all things crypto in 2014, but mainly passively, just as a Bitcoin holder and as somebody who believed in frictionless value transfer. I had bad experiences with the banking system as a young DJ, and Bitcoin was just kind of interesting to me because I studied finance in college. Fast forward to 2017, during the rise of Ethereum, I got really, really excited about how that building applications on top of blockchains might help the music business. Of course, just a financial layer isn't enough to kind of wrap in the complexity of the music business. So Ethereum sort of inspired me to start exploring those things. And in 2018, I did some NFT experiments with a live music festival that we called OMF, Our Music Festival. We threw a festival in San Francisco at Berkeley Theater with a bunch of artists. And that was kind of my first experimentation phase with NFTs and as like music collectibles in some way, shape, or form. It was a bit early then. So fast forward to 2020, right after COVID hit, I started seeing NFTs kind of rise up again post CryptoKitties as a way to authenticate digital art. And so I saw artists like Xcopy and Trevor Jones selling NFTs of their artwork. And I was just fascinated by that use case of unique identifiers on chain for authentic digital art. And at the time, no one had really experimented with music. So I started asking around, like, how could this work for music? How could we use NFTs for music? And a lot of the people at the time didn't have a clear answer. It was difficult. So we started experimenting. When I say we, I mean my art director, Slime Sunday. Some of you might know his artwork. He's been my art director for the Blau project for many, many years. And I was like, okay, well, people don't seem to understand NFTs for music, but what if we did audio reactive visuals with unreleased music? And so Those were some of the earliest music NFT experiments in 2020, where we sold, I think our first sale was 3 or 4 unreleased songs with 3 or 4 visual accompaniments, and we generated about $21,000 from that, surprisingly so. We had no idea people were interested in like rare, authentic sounds with visual art. And then in February of 2021, I did an auction on the 3-year anniversary of my only album that's in the world, that set a couple records at the time for NFT sales. So from 2020 to 2021, it was mostly experimentation with technology, thinking about the different use cases of NFTs for music. And then after this big auction, a lot of people started asking me, well, how could we leverage this technology to benefit, to monetize, to create community, et cetera? And I didn't really have an answer. And that's when I started Royal as a way to start thinking about, okay, like what tools can we build for everyone to engage in this ecosystem, not just somebody who's educated about crypto.
That's right. And I think it's a bit of an understatement to say that, your drop, it broke some records. That was the defining moment for music and crypto at the time. I basically would say that you became the guy that everyone in the entire music industry was like, how do I sell my music as NFTs? And to kind of set the scene there, this was during the Nifty Gateway era. There was everyone dropping music left and right, people who have never downloaded a wallet selling NFTs, and a bunch of mayhem that came on the back of that. And so I guess without going into too much details on like the specific monetary side of things, talk to me emotionally about that time and, what that was kind of like for you having this major moment, then having to deal with, everyone basically flooding your inbox to figure out how to use the space.
Yeah, I think everything you said is exactly right. At the time, it was February of 21, at the end of February, this is about 3 weeks before Beeple's historic auction. But my auction was the first that wasn't on an existing platform. So we did it on my website, which was kind of crazy. We leveraged digital audio at the time, like Clubhouse was a huge reason why it was successful. Everyone was stuck at home in the middle of COVID. And it was the first NFT sale that I believe it was the first NFT sale over the $10 million mark, which definitely made some noise. Then, of course, 3 weeks later when Beeple did his auction, I think that really set the entire world in motion to paying attention to the technology and trying to get a better understanding of what it was capable of. So just as you said, exactly as you said, a lot of musicians were sort of calling and saying, hey, like, how do we do this too? And I guess, not to give myself too much credit, there were a bunch of other artists before me that experimented with the technology. RAC is one of them, who's a close friend of mine. I met him at an Ethereum conference in New York City in 2017, and we were the only 2 musicians there. There weren't that many other people that were paying attention to the tech. But you also did have Imogen Heap, and you had a great project called Ujo that was part of the consensus conglomerate around Ethereum, and that was really, Ujo was really the first Ethereum-based crypto music project back in the day. And so there were a lot of people that had been experimenting with music on chain, Audius as well as a streaming service, but no one had really explored. It's important for me to give all this context because I don't want to sound like we were the first or anything like that, but it was the first to make a big financial impact. And I think that's what really, as everybody knows in crypto, a big financial impact is what drives activity and excitement. It's just how it is, right? We can't really beat around that bush. And so, the idea of owning visual art seemed obvious because it was analogous to the physical world, right? So there are physical art pieces, and then there are prints or replicas of those pieces that trade at different prices. There's an original that's usually higher. Sometimes prints still trade very highly if there's a limited quantity of them, whether that's, or even sculptures that have multiple quantities, like a Daniel Arsham sculpture of a Bulbasaur, right? But they're still rare, and there's still something tangible about owning a physical visual item. And what I couldn't really figure out, and what I think we're still figuring out, and what the topic of this conversation I'm sure is going to be about, is what does ownership look like for music, which is inherently invisible, right? And so it's just a different problem. It's not quite the same as visual art. And exactly as you said, after my auction, a lot of people were asking, how do we leverage this technology too for all of its benefits? And we all had ideas of what the answer could be, but it wasn't as clear as it was for visual art. And then, of course, we saw, after the Beeple era and after the Nifty Gateway era, we saw the explosion of PFPs, which are a form of fashion and visual art identity, however you want to call it. And music sort of just sputtered along on a different path where visual art went like this and music kind of went like this. Or I should say maybe like this and then like this. So I think that's where, the next 5 to 10 years is all about thinking about, okay, what does it mean for music to be on chain, right? Because there's a lot of ways you could think about that. And what does it mean to own music? Is that the CD or the vinyl digital equivalent? Can you liken it to visual art? Can you not liken it to visual art? Is it a different medium entirely? And how do we think about the idea of owning it, I think is really the biggest question.
100%. And I've always admired that you've been so practical about your approach to the space, because even following a sale like the one that you had, those were the earliest music NFTs. Like you said, it was really the first thing that commercialized the space, that people said, oh, you can actually sell your music as an NFT and have people collect that. But then very quickly you were like, hey, this still leaves a lot on the table. And I think a lot of the impetus for Royal was that you were saying, hey, I could make $10 million selling collectibles of my music, but I think that there's a deeper level of ownership that can be unlocked here. And I would, love to kind of hear about how you went from a sale like you had with Ultraviolet to then starting Royal, and kind of the difference between the way you kind of structured those drops and how they operate today.
Yeah, I think, and that's kind of where a lot of this isn't necessarily public information, but it's also nothing to be quiet about. It's just I haven't necessarily published all of the findings / explorations that happened after a $12 million auction, when the music industry is like, what the fuck? Let's be real. Like, no one really understood what was going on. There were a lot of lawsuits, and some of them are even public. Some of them are on Google, all of which were settled. There wasn't anything that actually went to litigation. But in kind of exploring all these lawsuits and hiring great attorneys, because, we didn't know what the outcome would be. And I did own the master recording rights of the album. We didn't really sell the music. We sold art that had the music in it, right? And so there were all these questions, there were all these legal questions. And that's when I started thinking, well, for visual art, it's like the IP side is a little bit more straightforward. For music, the IP side is, there weren't any laws surrounding digital collectibles, let alone fractional ownership of a song. There was nothing really surrounding that. And it was subject to the interpretation of anyone who wanted to interpret it. And because of those legal battles, I kind of decided at the time, and I don't know if I necessarily feel the same way today, but I kind of decided at the time that collectible music, whether it's stored on IPFS or not, if the NFT contains a song, you probably need some sort of license. And that type of license doesn't even exist in statutes today. And so if you remove the audio from the NFT or from the metadata of the NFT, right, then you sort of get around all these issues that come into play with big artists that already exists. For new artists, they have the flexibility of kind of negotiating new terms with new music. But for all these existing songs and these big artists, like, how would they do NFTs? Well, if it contains the song, they're all going to run into all the same legal battles that I had to run into. And so I said, well, let's just remove the song, and that solves the problem. But then what do you own if you don't own a collectible MP3 file? Well, you got to own something significant, and maybe that is a part of the song. And so Royal was founded upon that principle of, what if you could actually own rights in the song instead of a digital collectible of the song? Would that sort of circumvent the legal issues that I was facing? And would it also be more meaningful to the buyer? Would the buyer care if the audio was there? Are people going to listen to their NFTs, or are they going to listen to music as they would anywhere else? Do people look at their art collection on their OpenSea profile, or do people like me who own a lot of art NFTs actually just have the photos on my iCloud that I cast to my Apple TV, right? Do I need to actually display the IPFS metadata, or is that just proof that I own it, and then I can put the digital art, I could populate the digital art from wherever, right? And so these were all the questions that we were all asking at the time. People were building NFT displays, but like, why? Because the NFT is just the authenticity that you own it. Do you really need a display to index your wallet? I don't know, right? Like, these are still questions that we're all asking ourselves. And that's, this is the first wave of this movement. So I imagine we'll figure it out over the next couple of years.
Yeah, and I feel like you did such a good job with Royal of making it palatable for major artists. So obviously Royal's had jobs with people like Chainsmokers and Diplo and a host of others that you've definitely heard of before. And I feel like in a lot of ways what you did is you set up a foundation where an artist who wasn't familiar with, crypto or NFTs or anything felt comfortable actually releasing a drop through Royal because they felt like they were doing it in a way that was very native to them. To them, it was intuitive to say, hey, I'm selling a percentage of the song and giving ownership to my fans. I don't think it's intuitive to most artists today to say, I'm selling a digital collectible. And while I'm someone who's obviously a big advocate for that, I've just noticed time and time again for larger established artists in the space, they really just don't understand the form factor of selling a digital collectible when you can openly stream the music on Spotify.
I think that's absolutely right. I think the right-click save equivalent for music is more problematic. What I mean by that is, you can buy the Mona Lisa on Amazon, but it's not the real Mona Lisa, and everybody knows that, right? That's the physical right-click save version of physical art. When you display digital art, especially PFPs, I think PFPs really proved this out nicely. If you're using a CryptoPunk that isn't yours on Twitter, and let's say you have your ENS domain published on your Twitter, hypothetically, right? As most people do. If you didn't own that punk, people would call you out, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or if you didn't own that ape, people would be like, that's not your ape. It's like really quick to associate visual identity with ownership. It can happen instantaneously and you can, of course, check it on chain. What is the equivalent of that? Let's even remove royalty-bearing assets for a second. Let's just talk about music collectibles. What's the equivalent of being able to prove you have a limited music collectible in a quick way? Well, that would require your social profile to have a music tab, right? To kind of show others what music you own collectively, not even with royalties associated, right? And none of the social platforms have really enabled that. Even Instagram, has tried, all these social platforms have tried, but really only dating apps actually incorporate music as part of their profile experience, which I think is really just kind of funny. Because you'd think, maybe every social platform would have a bigger presence of music because it is such a big part of people's identities. And so music, you sort of encounter this problem of how do you prove that you own something that matters? What's the social signal? What's the community aspect? The way, apes sort of capture that community. The second I see another ape on Twitter, you know something about someone. How does that exist for music? It's just difficult, right? And so exactly as you said, owning a piece of a song it was easier for someone to understand, for an existing established artist to understand that variable more than, a collectible. But what I would say is nobody really has the answer. There isn't a right or wrong way. And I think everyone who's excited about Web3 and music is sort of at the stage, yourself and myself included, figuring out, okay, what is it that more people will care about? Because there is a select community, a very small community of people that like the idea of collectibles, that like the idea of fractional ownership, that like one-of-ones, which on the collectible side, that makes the most sense to me. It feels really special to have the only edition of a song on Ethereum or on whatever L2 blockchain, someone might be minting on, right? But I do think, part of the reason PFPs worked and Beeple and some of these artists worked is because there was sort of a cap on the quantity, and there was a small club of people that could own something. And there's differing philosophies on this, where the open edition gets the most people involved. The scarce edition can probably appreciate more by nature of it being scarce. And we're all sort of just playing with these different form factors in hopes of a larger audience beginning to understand it, right? And I think that's all of our goals who are exploring the Web3 and music space is what can we build that someone who's non-crypto native would understand and not even just understand, but want to participate. Because another thing I'll say is Royal has a huge audience. When I talk to other music industry professionals or artists, everybody knows about us. It doesn't mean everybody's coming to use it, right? A lot of people might know about something. It doesn't mean you're paying for ownership in a song. It's you've heard of Masterclass, but have you actually watched a lot of masterclass videos? I ask a lot of people this question because they actually have a pretty big audience, but almost everyone's heard of masterclass, but not everyone has a subscription. And so that's sort of where we're at with on-chain music and Web3 music is like, people have heard about it, but like, are they actually going to spend time in their day to engage?
I think the answer right now is no. I think that most people do not take the time to engage because there's not a compelling enough reason for it. And I think on my side, a big reason for that is there seems to be a bit of like a cultural gap right now where I don't really think there's a social platform for music that is actively being embraced by the younger generation of artists right now. I think we all know the importance of Spotify or TikTok, but I think what was really defining about SoundCloud back in the day is that it meant something to be on SoundCloud. Like when you got a repost from your favorite artist, that was really valuable. Or when you reposted music yourself, that was a very big representation of your own taste. And I feel like in the current music landscape today, I don't really know if there's a good place for you as a fan of music to really signal, your identity around it in a way that felt as meaningful as what SoundCloud did for a lot of artists very early on.
Yeah, on the artist side and on the consumption side, like for me, in one of my closets, I had a bunch of vinyls up in my college dorm room of all my favorite albums, which included like Radiohead and Rainbows, M83, some of the earlier M83 albums. Saturdays Equals Youth is one of my favorite albums. And I have the vinyls of those, and they're in my dorm room in college. They're part of your identity, right? And like, that's like, would I pay, if there was a rare form of those digitally, would I pay for it? Absolutely. In fact, Radiohead sort of experimented with this within Rainbows, where you could like pay what you wanted to download the album. It was genius at the time. And then you also have versions of this, which is like the Wu-Tang Clan album, of course, where like there's like only one and only one person can ever listen to it. And there's some other there's reasons why that happened. It wasn't actually intended to. The intention of the Wu-Tang album was sort of backhanded in the sense that they could never have actually released the album publicly because certain things weren't cleared. But humans have experimented with the idea of music and scarcity. Even today, vinyl is rare for popular albums, right? It just doesn't carry the same appreciation potential as the visual art world has, as PFPs have, as owning an art blocks piece has. And so, I wonder, we've seen more recently, right? The generative art, one of the most rare generative art pieces, the Goose, sold for over $6 million. Like, what is music's moment for that? Or I should say, those moments have happened for visual art over the course of the past 3 years of the NFT boom. I would say it's been exactly 3 years because I started exploring it in June of 2020 is when I was like, actually, it was Trevor Jones' Bitcoin bull that sold to Pablo, who's now a friend of mine, for $55,000. That blew my mind. Absolutely blew my mind. $55,000 for a piece of digital art. Now, it was an awesome piece of art. Don't get me wrong. But that's where I was starting to say, okay, like, there's something here for visual art. And that's carried. Even though there's been a bear market for NFTs, if you compare it to 3 years ago for visual art, it's way better than it used to be. It was, people would sell art on Super Rare for 1 ETH and freak out. Like, that's how it used to be. Now it's like visual artists are regularly making money. The same is not true for music over the past 3 years. It's almost in the same place it always was, with like a little marginal improvement. But we don't see $6 million Goose generative sales in music at all. We barely, and that doesn't have to be about that, but artists are, sort of barely making enough money from collectibles today as much as they were in the peak of the market.
That's right. And I think a big question for me is, how do you get to a point where the sale of music is not directly correlated to the sale of, NFTs broadly, the crypto market broadly? As we've seen in the past, it's basically like when the market gets hot, that's when artists get paid. And I think what I'm really asking now is there a world where music can have a market outside of ETH going up 500%, and can it actually start to be a little bit less correlated in the sense that an artist can be getting paid to sell their music on chain without ETH needing to go up 10x for people to care about it? And historically, we haven't really seen that be the case. So I think that's really the biggest challenge for this next chapter ahead here.
Right. And I think the ultimate question is, will selling music on chain be the killer use case, or is it something else for a musician, right? Because a musician does a lot of things. A vision like this isn't to, a visual artist makes visual art and publishes that content to the internet. Those are the steps. Like, it's pretty straightforward. Musicians, however, and a visual artist may have a social community, a Discord community, right? But generally, for visual artists, there's the content they make, the community they have, and the publishing on the internet. Musicians have like 8 variables, right? Musicians have the music, the art that accompanies the music, which includes still and animation, right? Music video. They have merch, which, like visual artists can have merch as well, but artists have tour merch, they have album merch, they have all different types of merch, right? Then you have the live performance, which people did a live performance, right? So like, yes, visual artists can play in this other realm, but all musicians technically, are playing with the performance realm, right? Then you've got the community aspect, the same as visual artists, where you've got Discord, but then you've also got, your Spotify monthly listeners, you've got, profiles across every, you've got profiles across every music platform and every social platform, right? And so there's just more variables at play, which I think makes it even more difficult to say, okay, like, what aspect of the musician does a fan or consumer care to own? With visual art, it's a little bit more simple. When you own I own a bunch of Thank You X pieces in my house, physical and digital. I have Thank You X NFTs and Thank You X physicals, and I'm a huge fan of his work. As he does more work, I feel like an owner of Thank You X. I also own music collectibles and, of course, royal assets across the spectrum. I feel, even with royal assets, I feel less of that sense of ownership as I do with visual art with Thank You X. Why? Well, I think this is where you and I both, we've spoken about this outside of the podcast, but like, how do you get exposure to the musician as a whole? Because you have all these different variables. You have the live performance, you have the community, you have one album here, you have one single here, you have a remix, right? You have all these different things going on. How can you feel closest to the musician as an entity instead of just in one aspect, aka the song?
Yep.
And I think that's sort of where we bang our heads against the wall and say, well, regulation is sort of preventing us from seeing this through the way we want it to be seen through, which is like, invest in the artist, right? Like, call it a day. Like, that's the answer, right? That's the obvious conclusion, but we can't get there today, at least in a way that's accessible to everyone. It can be accessible to accredited investors. There could be a token that gets unlocked in a year that has certain restrictions and all the bullshit that, like, that's not why the space blew up. The space didn't blow up from the restrictions. It blew up from the composability, the liquidity, the speed at which this art could trade. And a lot of people that came into the space for speculation stayed because they believed. And I think that's like the stage that we're at now, is like, some people left because they can't make money anymore. But other people are here every day racking their brains on like, what's going to make more people understand what's going on, because they believe, because they know that there's something here that benefits artists and that benefits fans who previously had no exposure to the upside of an artist. Like, you, as a fan, you could not make money on your taste in music. At least with tokens, you can today. At least we made that step from 0 to 1. What's going to get us from 1 to 100? I don't know.
So much to unpack there. You touched on like 5 different things that I want to dive into. I would say from a high level, I believe that crypto is really good at getting people to come in for the money and stay for the culture. I think that's kind of the stage we're in right now, where even in the absence of people making a lot of money selling NFTs, they still are around because there's a culture here. There's artists that they really love. They feel like they're involved in the journey in some way, shape, or form. But I think you're exactly right that we have not really found the form factor for how you should support a musician at scale. And I think that I really want to go into the investing in artist things because there's a lot to unpack there. It actually dovetails nicely into what you recently released at Royal, which is to say that in order to invest in artists, I think it's fundamentally important to be able to understand the worth and value that a musician is making today. And that comes down to a very granular unit of saying, how much is a song worth? And I know that this was a big inspiration for why you started Royal in the first place. So maybe you can talk about just that question of how difficult it is to understand how much a song is worth, and then how that ties into the tool that you guys just released.
Absolutely. And that is exactly right. I think the first input to thinking about getting exposure to a musician is at the minimum, I call it the minimum viable unit of the song, because the song is ultimately like there is nothing smaller than a song except for sample packs, which, yes, we could get into that. But for most people, the minimum viable unit is the song. And, this is where, without going too deep, I decided to go independent 7 years ago. And going independent's a little bit scary. It was scary at the time. There were less tools to do so. You never know if, like, when you go to hit publish on a song, like, who's going to hear it if you don't have a partner with a label or if you don't have a promotion strategy. And so I was sort of forced into doing a lot of those things myself to learn very quickly that you could kind of replicate a lot of the things that a label does yourself if you really put your mind to it. Different labels, different services. I think there's still a lot of value in record labels for sure. But the percentage that they take on average is just too high for what they do. I think everyone would probably agree with that, even the labels themselves. I mean, that's why they make money, right? And so the Royal recently launched something called the Song Valuation Calculator, because I found that, like, a lot of people say artists don't get paid. Streaming doesn't pay artists. And like, what people don't understand is before streaming, artists really made nothing because everyone, Napstered their music or LimeWired their music or whatever it might be. And the only way musicians got paid was from touring and then from the small 99-cent minus Apple tax minus everything else fee on iTunes. Streaming actually introduced the first real sustainable revenue model on recorded music. It was just that other people were taking 88%, which is the statistic is middlemen take 88% of that income. So after tax, you're looking at 6%. Let's be realistic of, like, what you're going to keep. And yeah, so when people say artists don't get paid, if you're making 6% of $1 million and you're to make $1 million, you need hundreds of millions of streams. Yeah, like, not that many people are going to be in that club, right? But if you own 100%, what do those numbers look like? And so that was the inspiration for the Song Valuation Calculator. Is like, if aggregate all the ownership of this one song, what would the private market value that song at? You can't find that information online. So we built it just as a way to prove to people that there is real value here, that people are willing to pay about, on average, 10 times the annualized cash flow of a song for the ownership in that song. That's about what the market is paying for catalog. And we've seen, Ryan Tedder, Bruce Springsteen's, even Post Malone sell catalog or previous ownership in previous songs for crazy amounts of money. Even at a small scale for a new artist, that still could be exciting. It might not be in the hundreds of millions, but if a new artist can make 100,000, 200,000, 50,000 off of their rights, it's probably going to be more competitive than what a record label might offer. And so that's like one side. The other side of it is, well, if you're a real fan of an artist, what is the emotional value premium you'd be willing to pay to say that you own it, that you really own it, right? Like, there's the cash flow piece, which is how private markets think about music. But if I could really own a piece of In Rainbows by Radiohead, one of my favorite albums of all time, I would be willing to pay a heavy premium for that privilege. And that's kind of what art is about. It's all about emotional value premium, because the cost of the canvas and the paint is minimal. It's the reputation of the artist and the actual work itself that moves you to buy it. Same is true of any luxury good as well. So, so the whole idea behind the Song Valuation Calculator was, okay, let's start somewhere where, like, people don't think music is valuable. Let's just show them that it is, even at a small scale. And I had one independent artist reach out, or a couple of independent artists reach out after we launched this thing to say, well, this seems kind of right because I do make this much. And if I multiply this by over a 10-year period, based on streams, then, like, yeah, I would make this. So that's kind of cool, right? It's like people start to realize, oh, there's value here. Now, I don't know where streaming is going, right? Like, there are more songs ever being released. The depreciation is probably going to increase on any new music, right? So there's all these other variables at play. But having a starting point just to show people, hey, owning music is valuable, it means something, is it's a great place to start.
And I think it's so important because it helps people actually visualize the worth of a song. And I think in so many ways, it's an asset that's extremely difficult to value. Like you said before, it's basically these private companies that are valuing songs behind closed doors. But I don't think we've ever seen, like, you hear people say, like, yeah, 1 million streams is $3,700, whatever it is. But it's very difficult to, like, really conceptualize that until you actually paste in that song link. And you say, like, okay, this song is worth 50 grand. This song is worth 100 grand, et cetera. And I think why that's so important is because it allows us to look at the bigger picture, which is to say, if an artist has 10 songs, if they have 20 songs, and you add up the entirety of all those different pieces, now you can start to formulate a little better understanding of what is this artist actually worth. Because to your point,
Exactly.
it's not just the songs. It's also the touring. It's also the publishing. It's also the merchandise, the sync placements. There's so many variables here, but I think that to me, why I'm so excited about the Song Calculator is that it starts to open up the question of how do I better understand an artist's worth? And I think that that's a huge, huge unlock for the music industry at large.
And for the artists themselves, because there are lots of artists that don't even know what their music is worth after they've released it. Like they've signed this record deal. They're making money on touring. They're not thinking about how much the music is worth. And then they see, there are a couple of artists that are friends of mine that use the calculator. They're like, I didn't know that. Maybe next time I will do it independently. Now it's the likelihood of success is lower when you decide to do something independently, inevitably, right? Because there's all these other variables that come into play when you're a part of a bigger system. But if you can carry your own weight on social, on TikTok or wherever it is, maybe there is a likelihood that you get to keep that money that you're otherwise giving away. Now, the extrapolation after that is, well, if a fan owns it too, how much louder is the fan going to be? And that's the part that I don't think anybody's really proved yet. But if the 1,000 true fan theory holds true, and those 1,000 true fans have financial incentive, which is the ethos of crypto as a whole, right? Like these PFP communities rise and fall together with the conviction of the members, right? And how many more, and what the future value of that community might be. The same should be true of musicians and their fans. It is maybe a degree separated than PFPs, of course, but if you are a fan and an artist is exploding and you own a piece of their music, can you actually influence more people to listen to that music at a rate that benefits you financially and the artist financially? And I think the answer at scale to that question is yes. It's just very, very, very difficult to prove out. And then you also run into all the other issues with the recorded music business, which is transparency, payouts, all that other stuff that we sort of solve at Royal. We're starting to solve at Royal. We're starting to build the tools to help solve those problems, but we have a long way to go.
I think the next chapter that I'm most excited about is on-chain royalties and figuring out what this looks like when all of this is happening on-chain in the first place. I feel like the thing that I commend you the most for with what you built at Royal is that being able to work with the traditional royalty system and put that into a Web3 format is very difficult. Being able to go in and say, like, here's how royalties actually work in the traditional world today. Here's how much the stream is being paid out. Here's how you actually give that distribution to a token holder. Like, there's so many pieces that are connecting basically the existing legacy world to what I would consider like the frontier, which is what Web3 is doing. And I feel like you guys are in such honestly a challenging space where being able to connect those two worlds is so difficult, but it's such a necessary piece of the equation to allow this new frontier to really prosper in the way that I think it's really meant to in the future.
Yeah, it's 100% right. Keeping everything in its own world is quite easy. If you keep all the Web3 income in Web3 world, there's a lot of open source material you can use to just facilitate a lot of that income splits, whatever it might be. It's bridging between the worlds that's most difficult. And then of course, it's going to be really difficult to convince all of these legacy actors to just making payments on a blockchain. Like who knows how long that's going to take, if it even ever happens. And part of my attraction to Audius was the idea that, like, if you pre-fill your wallet and you pay a lower rate per stream, but the artist gets a higher rate after all the middlemen take out their stuff, right? Like, if you're, let's say on Audius, you're only paying, instead of 0.03, you're paying 0.02, but the artist is keeping 90 of it instead of 10% of it. Well, it's going to cost you less to stream the music, because realistically, are you really going to stream 10,000 songs a month? Probably not. Is there a difference between active listening and passive listening? And the value that is? Like, I listen to sleep playlists. Like, should that really be treated in the same financial category as active listening music? Like, these are all really weird questions that we don't have the answers to. But why was Audius super interesting to me initially was the fan would probably pay less if they pre-fill their wallet, and the artists would all make more. But getting everybody to adopt that standard is a whole other question when it's just easier, right? And so I think that's the headline for crypto. It's harder but you have potential financial upside. So what gets you to overcome the friction? The idea that you can make money, whether you're an artist or whether you're a user, even pre-NFT or post-NFT explosion, right? Like what's on the other, if what's on the other side of the friction is money, more people will go through the friction, right? The problem is like for everyday use, the friction is just too high today.
Yeah. And I think this is the challenge about where the market currently is to say that 2017, we saw ICOs, 2018, 2019, we saw DeFi summer, we saw NFTs, PFPs, seeing meme coins recently. Basically, like the largest influx of capital from the average consumer into crypto is something that is extremely meme driven. It's like super loosely objective. There's not actually underlying financial infrastructure that's like valuing these assets. I think something that I struggle with, and I know that you do too, is how does crypto as a whole mature to the point where you can actually start to have tokens and assets that are actually trading on the back of real world earnings and not just on the back of emotions and memes? And I think that there's still such a big question for this next cycle coming up, which is say like, what does that look like? Does the space mature into assets that are actually underlyingly backed by these artists' earnings? Or is it just going to be the new version of the PFP, which is just some random meme schema that everyone gets really excited about?
It's interesting. I don't think of it as black and white. And it's so easy to hate on the memes. And I do. Like generally, I think it's really dumb. But at the same time, the mimetic value of Pepe is the combined emotional conviction that all these different people have in Pepe. It makes sense. It might not like, and then to take it a step further, like I don't even know what the U.S. government, I don't even know what's backing the dollar anymore, right? So it's like it's also some aggregation of human belief, right? And so on the one hand, like everything is valued based on human belief, and if you get enough people to believe in something. The Pepe phenomenon was remarkable in that it was like 0 to 1.5 billion in like a month. So that's like $1.5 billion worth of financial belief. Even if it's dumb financial belief, that's what it is. And so, the possibilities are sort of endless, right? Like we don't really know what the next wave will manifest as. But what we do know is that people are financially driven, right? And so if there's some combination of real world and emotional value, that was always the thesis for Royal, is like there is something real backing the asset. But if the asset trades at a 200x multiple, that's just like a lot of equities. Even Amazon today is trading at 80x earnings, right? Why? Because people believe that it will be worth 80x earnings in 10 years. That's how we think about equities and their value. Is like people assume that the value of the company is believed to be true 10 years into the future. The same could be said about musicians. If the product is done right, like whatever that product might be, whether it's owning a piece of an artist, it's owning a piece of an album, it's owning a collectible, or it's owning a membership pass, whatever it might be. And the thing is really, I know we're running out of time. The thing is, at the end of the day, if the artist is truly meaningful enough to a group of people, they probably are willing to pay. Now, for what? I don't know, but they're willing to pay. And that's what artists sort of need to explore and what platforms need to explore. What is it that a true fan is really willing to pay for? Not just patronage, not just, hey, I believe in this artist and I want to support them. That's cool. That's Kickstarter, right? Like that exists. You don't need crypto for that. But if you are a real fan and you want to be in constant communication with a musician, now that musician controls the data that they generate, which they don't with any Web2 platform, right? I still have to send a selfie video to Spotify that Spotify sends to my top 1% of listeners, thanking them every year. But I don't know who those people are, right? Like that's the problem. I think the biggest problem that Web3 solves is not the monetization problem. I think it's the data problem for musicians. And the monetization problem is just kind of what brought people in. And this is where, we could talk about this forever, where, I hate comparing streams to NFT sales because they're sort of operating on different principles. It's almost like I've seen the Mona Lisa, that's the stream. I own the Mona Lisa, no, I don't, right? Consumption and ownership are two different layers, and a stream is ultimately just the consumption of a song. The same way when you look at an image on OpenSea, you're consuming it. doesn't mean you own it, right? And so that's where the space, I should say, like all the people like yourself, like myself, that are thinking every single day about these problems, we're sort of responsible for figuring out what that form factor is. What is the asset that makes the music feel like it's truly yours, and or makes you feel like you're truly more connected to the artist than you otherwise would have been without the asset, right? And that's where we don't know. I think with some of the earlier experiments I did, I took a bunch of the auction winners backstage at EDC, some people that paid hundreds of thousands of dollars for my assets. Some of those people that came with me, there were 3 of them, said that like you couldn't even put a price on that experience. Okay, so like artists should push to create those types of experiences. What do those look like? And eventually, if the experiences are good enough, more people will want the asset. And so there's all these different variables at play.
I feel like we have so many different areas that we could dive in here. I want to be really sensitive of your time and make sure we can talk a little bit more about Royal and what's next for you. I think just to kind of summarize everything you just said there, for me, I think the design space is where do people get involved with less than $10 that feels meaningful to them. And I think the most promising next chapter that I've seen recently has been the migration of music to layer 2s, being able to collect a song for $10 or less, being able to have, upwards of 100,000 mints and beyond, and just exploring what happens there, because I don't know what that market looks like at scale, but it does feel like it's significantly differentiated from previous cycles, and saying that, the last chapter of NFTs was we're minting monkeys for hundreds of thousands of dollars. Most people don't have hundreds of thousands of dollars. Most people have $100 in disposable income. And how do you create a game and a system where those people feel excited and emotionally attached to that in the same way that they did with their PFPs, but doing that in a much more democratized way where there doesn't need to be life savings on the line, and there can actually be, $50, $100 that people are playing with, but still having that same level of emotional love and support that they really saw with this last cycle. So yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts there, but that's just kind of where my head's at with kind of the design space we're playing with in the next couple of years here.
Yeah, so we started Royal on, the first experiment was on mainnet, but very, very quickly after, it was inevitable in my head that things needed to be on layer 2s for music for different reasons than the scalability of minting, more so for the payout infrastructure, right? Like if it costs you $5 to collect 6, why would you pay that gas? When you're thinking about royalty migration off-chain, on-chain, that's like sort of why we were thinking about layer 2s. Less so for the reasons of like someone with $10 just wants to participate. I think like the sort of problem with thinking about 100,000 music mints is really not the 100,000 or the scalability or the people that could or could not buy it because of the $10 versus $100,000 for an ape. I think the question is like, what are you buying when you're minting? That's the real question. Like if you're not buying something significant, it doesn't matter how many mints are possible. If those mints just represent patronage, it doesn't really matter, right? Because you can do that without a blockchain if you're just donating to an artist, or if you want to represent that donation on chain, sure, then it's like sort of interesting. But the question of like, what are you actually minting or buying, I think is the most important question, because the accessibility has already been proven to not matter. And what I mean by that is like, the issue is not that people only have $10 to spend. The issue is that they don't have a wallet, or they don't know how to buy. Because there are people that are willing to spend $50 or $60 on a live performance ticket. But would somebody be willing to spend that on a digital collectible? No, because there's no experience attached to it, right? And if there isn't an experience attached to one of 100,000 music NFTs, even if it's $1, the question of why is still a question. If there was an answer to the why, like maybe it was exclusive to Onchain and it didn't exist anywhere else, then maybe there's something there. But if it exists somewhere else, you sort of already violate the exclusivity or the why. I do think that and then it gets ripped and then you can listen to it somewhere else. There's all these different questions, gating consumption, if that's even the solution. Is it the $10 question, or is it something more meaningful? And I stand by the general philosophy that you should be able to participate in the ecosystem no matter the price. That's a no-brainer. But I don't think the difference between $1 or 100 is really the issue. It's where is the meaning? What is the value? That is the real question. And if you're just a listener of songs, the $9.99 it costs to have a Spotify membership gets you quite a bit of value, the way it does with any subscription service. The value has to come from something more than the song. Then, if you're any dollar amount more than $9.99 that someone is willing to pay, that person has to feel like they are getting something beyond the song, the consumption of the song. And that's where the question lies. It's like, what can artists do to push that narrative forward and to change it? And maybe there is an artist that actually builds an audience only in the on-chain world, and they can build such a strong audience that they never even need to operate in the legacy ecosystem. I definitely believe that's possible. I can't wait for that to happen. I think it will happen at some point. But I think the central question is the why. Like, why does somebody want to own a Bored Ape? I can answer that. Why does somebody want to own a part of a song? I can answer that. Sometimes it's cash flow, sometimes it's the emotional value. Why does somebody want to be one of 100,000 people that collects something? I can answer it. It's like, you want to support. You want to show support. But is it really because you want to listen to the song on chain? That's maybe a question for you as we sort of, get to the end. Is like, is that something you care about, like to listen to the song on chain?
I think I care about the cultural significance of what the song being on chain means. And I think for a lot of these new artists, they're really symbolizing their career on the back of the music they're putting out on chain first, where to your point, maybe it is on Spotify, but I'd say that most of the artists doing well in the space today are not putting their music on Spotify. Or if they are, Spotify is kind of an afterthought after they release it on chain. And I think that's what you're really buying into, is the acknowledgement that collecting this music is the best way to support them in the way they're valuing their career, because the on-chain native format is the way that they most value their art.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've experimented with that only once in the past 2 years. One open edition, one unreleased song that doesn't exist anywhere else, only on the token. And it actually succeeded more than I expected it to. Can that happen with every song? I don't know. Is that interesting in an album format? Probably. Mm-hmm. Is that interesting? What does it look like when it's not associated with the song and it's just an artist token, but it's highly limited? What does it look like when it's not limited at all and it's more in a POAP format, right? And at the end of the day, and I hate to say this, but there does need to be, like, as we've seen with everything in crypto, there has to be some financial incentive for people to overcome the friction until the friction is low enough where it doesn't matter anymore. And I do see a world where people just only consume music in this new format if the music is good enough to be consumed in the format, right? It's like people are willing to go through and jump through hoops if what's on the other side is good enough. And I think I love to see artists really pushing that boundary. It's something that I'm excited about. Obviously, we do it within the context of Royal for my own stuff, but I know of all the artists that are pushing the boundaries in that realm better than I do. And that's probably a conversation for another time, but it's exciting. It's exciting nonetheless.
100%. I'd say good enough or cool enough. And I think that's the place that I'd love to leave this off, is in saying that we've talked so much about investing in artists. I think that there's such a huge design space there that we can save for a future conversation. But I think we're both aligned in the sense of saying that fans want to own the music that they love. People want to get deeper involved with the artists that they go to see at shows and buy their merchandise from. And I think we're all trying to figure out the right form factor for that. So I guess it's kind of a closing question for you. What should people expect out of you and from Royal over the next couple months here?
Stuff that I can't talk about, unfortunately. But I think, like, for just to echo everything we both said, it's like I'm most excited about giving people the maximum exposure as close as they can get to investing in an artist compliantly and within the regulatory framework that we have to work in today. And so if I'm a guinea pig for that, or if other people are guinea pigs for that, let's try it. Let's push the boundary as hard as we can to get people to understand that owning music or being part of an artist's career is a really powerful mechanism. However that's manifested, I don't know. But anyone who's exploring that space should be going as hard as they can at it.
That's absolutely
and that's
right.
what we do at Royal, and that's what I know you support too.
Well, thank you for taking the time, man. We've had such an amazing journey thus far. And the thing that I love the most about you is I know in 5-10 years from now, we're still going to be here having these conversations. You're someone that I can constantly count on to be here, showing up, figuring out what the next chapter is. And even if we might not always have the same take on things, we're still in the same ballpark, in the same lane, and trying to figure out what this all looks like. So I found this conversation extremely valuable, and I'm really excited to see what you do in the next couple of years to come.
Likewise, dude. I've said this in the past, I don't think there's a right or wrong answer. I think at the end of the day, we all just want to see this intersection of technology and culture succeed at scale, right? And whatever is going to do that, we all should support. And I'm excited for the next 5 years of experimentation.
That's right. And to our listeners that are listening to it this Thursday, stay tuned for some exciting stuff coming up in Paris in a couple weeks. I won't spoil anything too much here yet, but I feel like there's going to be an exciting opportunity to really cement this conversation in person. So thank you guys for listening. We'll be back with another episode soon. And Justin, I look forward to future conversations to come.
Likewise, dude. Thanks for having me.
All right, guys. Peace.